Welcome to week 4 on ideology. I am thrilled to have you on board still, and I look forward to some more exciting blog posts this week. Before we get started, I wanted to talk about why we're even discussing ideology in this course. You're probably saying at this point, it's week 4, we're talking about the institutions in this course. Why aren't we talking about Congress, presidency, etc.? Well, there's two reasons for that. One is that our institutions are usually not thought of in context and with the sub-institutions as well. But more importantly is that the ideology really influences how our organizations, our institutions are set up and how they have changed over time. So what we'll be talking about this week is this idea that has started in our founding between smaller government that is more localized in the states or the localities and larger government that is represented in our federal system. So we talked about federalism last week, and now you're going to get the ideological reasoning behind all of that. And we'll see that shine through time and time again when we talk about the various institutions and how they've played out over time. So bear with me. My voice is a little rough this week from a cold, but we will get through this, and I think the blog post will be of interest to you at the end. So have a great week, and let's get started. So American ideology has many components, and we certainly won't be covering all of those this week, but I want to hit some of the highlights and then talk about the ways in which these have been implemented in some way, although we'll be doing that throughout the semester. So let's take a step back and talk about what ideology is and how it influences our system. So people have generally values, beliefs, and then an ideology. And they don't always recognize that they have all three of these things, but they do. So values are universal guiding principles that tend to tell us what we value in the world, hence the term values. So some people value family as their core value or friendship as their core value. Others, and the one we'll be working with, value work. So a value could be the idea that working is something that adults should do and something that people should be proud of. This isn't something that is necessarily true from culture to culture, that people go out and have a career and find meaning in those careers, but that is certainly a value that many Americans hold. Beliefs are a little bit different. Beliefs are applying values within the context of the real world, and that context may change, and they may be based on assumptions. There's not necessarily facts, although those can play into beliefs as well. So if you value work, then one belief you might have might be that all adults who want to work can find work if they try hard enough. So this may change. Maybe you go through a rough patch and are not able to find work, and your belief about people being able to find work, if they truly want it, may change. That doesn't necessarily change the underlying value. Usually the value stays intact and the beliefs change. Finally, we have ideology. And ideology is a cluster of these beliefs on a variety of topics. And usually, political ideology responds to questions of governmental authority, property ownership, and money. So really, it's a question of where government fits into our individual and collective values and beliefs. So following the same example of work, an example of ideology might be, since work is a common value, we believe that all adults who want to work can find it. If they try hard enough, government should not provide long-term unemployment assistance. So ideology might talk about some of the consequences of your values and beliefs, that long-term unemployment assistance is unnecessary, that food stamps should be limited to people who are trying to find work, and that cash assistance should only be in the rarest of circumstances. So that's an ideology. It's a cluster of beliefs, and you can think of it as a cluster of policy choices as well. So ideology in politics usually centers on some very specific questions. First is the origination of power. And this question is really, where does power come from in a country? And we're going to see that in our readings this week, that the origination of power is a fundamental question of governmental authority. So in a monarchy, it is believed that power comes from God and is handed down through humans until you get to the king. And in England, that's why many kings made great attempts to link themselves to kings going all the way back to Adam, to show that they had legitimacy in holding their power. In a democracy, or in a country with democratic values, there is a belief that power comes from the people, and that the people hold the power and give it to government. Other governmental structures also believe in this, but in varying ways. So democracy believes in popular decision-making. A republic believes that you hand over power to representatives who then make decisions. So the origination of power is an important question. And then the role of government in our everyday lives. What power should government have over these things that we do on a day-to-day basis? So whether government should be limited in its ability to tax and spend, or more powerful and more proactive in that way, depends on your ideology. So the role of government is a very important question for how ideology plays into this general concept of government. One other important facet of American ideology is American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism is this idea that America is somehow unique from other countries, either in its origin, how it began, or in its current practice. American exceptionalism is often used to say that America is better than other countries, not just different from, but better than other countries, and that it is as one president put it, a shining beacon on a hill. American exceptionalism has deep roots in our political culture, and it started fairly early. So it's important because it's for us, because it's important to understand political discourse, and that starts with the shape our institutions took early on and what they look like today. It also influences the way that individual citizens view the world around them. So it changes the tenor and sometimes the impact of policy as well, and it limits policy options if we believe that they are beneath us in some way, shape, or form. We don't necessarily accept policies that are too European or too Asian because we believe we are exceptional and different. So there is something to be said about America being different. And that is something that de Tocqueville pointed out early on. And he said that this difference in America stemmed from the fact that everyone chose to be here and leave their home countries. Now, that ignores a significant swath of people who did not choose to be here. It also ignores the fact that the people native to the land did not choose for people to come here, nor did they necessarily participate in this founding of the government moving forward. But others have talked about how this makes us different in terms of our history, that our history has changed America's future, that there's some path dependence because of how we started. And we'll talk about one of those arguments in a little bit. So there's two big strains of ideology that we need to confront. They are not the only strains of ideology in America, and they are not necessarily ones that everyone holds dear, but they are important in understanding our revolution and our founding, and certainly how our institutions are set up. The first of which is the most powerful ideological force in American history, which is classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, not to be confused with modern liberalism, is the idea that first, society is the product of individuals. So the core of society is individuals. And the highest good is attaining individual liberties for those individuals. So that government is not something that is proactive, but is reactive to the faults within humans. It is, in other words, a means to an end. And so it stresses individual freedoms or liberties, and the right to own and dispose of property over civic participation, so that it is patriotic to own property, it is patriotic to cultivate property, and that is the highest order. The major philosopher is one of our readings this week, John Locke, which we will talk about in a minute. Now, this is not the only ideology, and it wasn't the only ideology around the time of our revolution or of our founding. Republicanism has existed since ancient Greece, and it's the idea that society is a product of people coming together and giving up some freedom to live in relative peace and engage in civic duties. So what that means is that citizens in a republic will do multiple things. One is that they will remain engaged as individual citizens, and sometimes that means giving up freedom to do certain things, but in turn you get civil rights. But it also means that we choose representatives who then elevate the discussion above us. So there have been several reiterations of this. Ancient republicanism can be seen in Plato and Aristotle. In the Enlightenment, we have Rousseau writing about republicanism. And then in our own founding, and right after the Revolution, we have Madison and these rebuttals of and defenses of the Constitution that we'll talk about. So John Locke should sound familiar because John Locke essentially wrote our Declaration of Independence, and Thomas Jefferson changed a few things and signed his name to it, as did many others. Underlying John Locke and our particular reading is this idea that life, liberty, and property are the sole purposes for the existence of government. Now, our Declaration of Independence says life, liberty, and happiness, but Locke says life, liberty, and property, and in fact, we've adhered to Locke's life, liberty, and property in many ways. Much of our legal system and our rights in this country are set up so that the ownership of property is held in very high esteem. So, there are three key things to remember about Locke, some of which are in your reading. One overall is that Locke was a social contract theorist, and he believed that government needed the consent of the governed, that people that are individual citizens need to give their consent in order for there to be a legitimate government. It used to be prior to this that you just needed some divine intervention. And so, like I said, kings would trace themselves back to Adam. And in fact, Locke points out how foolish of an errand this is. Two, and this is really key into our reading here, Locke stressed the role of property and liberty in terms of government and good government. So the highest priority of government was securing the rights of citizens to own and cultivate property. So government is a necessary evil. It should be limited, and it should only do what the people tell it to do. And the ultimate goal was to protect property because people could not protect it themselves. In Locke's state of nature, we would have skirmishes over property, and there would be no arbiter of kind of neutrality. And so government provides this and provides us with some basic rules so that we can live happily and enjoy our property. And that brings us to our third point. Locke's ideas were revolutionary and quite treasonous at the time he wrote them. So, first, he's saying that the king is not given power by God, that man without government would be okay, except for some skirmishes over property, and that government was a necessary evil, and that individual rights and the people who worked the land and their rights were the ultimate goal. So think about that. In feudal England, you have someone telling the king, you have no right to this land, you have no right to this government. The people who work the land, as you read in our passage, should be the ones who have the right to say what's done with it and to own it. And that property ownership does not mean necessarily setting your name on something, but actually doing something with the land. So it's no surprise that John Locke was chased out of England because of his beliefs and his writings. Now, I didn't assign the Hart's reading that I usually assign to my 120 students, but I think it's important to understand Locke in the concept of American government. Locke wrote about government, in particular in England. This is not something that was written for the United States. In fact, the places where Locke wrote about the United States really didn't seem to apply to many of his concepts. He saw it as a rather brutal and uncivilized place, but a place where people could kind of grab land as they saw fit. So we have to put Locke into context. And that helps move on to this idea of a liberal tradition in America that Hartz puts forth. And his key idea is that American liberalism is different from liberalism elsewhere. We don't truly believe the same things that Locke said because we don't have the same history that Locke was writing about. So unlike countries like England and France who had a feudal tradition, feudal meaning the king would allow lords and barons to own the land. Ultimately, the king owned all of the land, but lords and barons had portions of it, and then that was divided up, and ultimately at the bottom, the people who worked the land had no ownership rights to the land and were actually tied to the land. So without a true feudal tradition, Hartz argues that American liberalism is actually a perversion of Locke. So we adhere to Locke, but Locke changes because we didn't have a feudal system. So Locke was advocating really a revolution, an overthrow of the feudal system. Well, we didn't have that here. We didn't have feudalism here. And so without a feudal system to overthrow, liberalism, or Lockeanism, as Hartz says, becomes the norm. And so we've actually changed Locke and what he says to fit our own needs. And that matters because a belief in the protection of property and individual rights becomes patriotism rather than a revolutionary idea. So it becomes the norm rather than a challenge. And that means that Locke's ideas were adopted in a way that they might not have been intended. So liberalism provides us with a guidepost, but we really have to understand it in terms of its place in history and its place geographically, and how that differed from us. So Republicanism is this idea that we should give up power to representatives who then represent us in government and our interests. There are a few key elements of republicanism. One is that we are all virtuous citizens. We stay informed, and that citizens can and should be dedicated to the public good over private affairs. This was echoed recently in President Obama's farewell address when he said that he is returning to the most important role an American can have, which is that of citizen. This is a very Republican idea. Small r, of course, because this is associated with an ideology and not a political party. The other is that there will be an enlightened statesman. And an enlightened statesman is an ideal government actor who is detached from his own personal values and status and does what is right for the country at any given point in time, even if, and especially if, it interferes with his personal wealth or property ownership. Common features exist between different Republican theorists, although people think of it differently. There's usually a distrust of executive figures and a preference to giving power to legislatures rather than to a president or a monarch. There's a concern that economic inequality destabilizes a republic, so that if people have vastly different fortunes, they cannot possibly engage in the same governmental enterprise. And that government is best when the area governed is small. And that when the people can go back to their normal day-to-day lives after governing. So Jefferson's yeoman farmer who, plants the seeds, sows his farm, and then can govern and come back to his farm is something that is held up as an ideal in many situations. So Republicanism has been said to be dead, that liberalism has kind of ruled the day, that the protection of property and individual rights is the American norm, but we have used it in our political ideology, both in terms of policy, but in terms of shaping institutions. So we generally distrust, although it has continued to happen, the growth of executive power. Sometimes we only vocally distrust it, and we don't really do anything about it. But we generally don't like it when the president or the executive branch has more power than it was granted in the Constitution. There are several pushes for things like term limits that would put a limitation on governmental actors in their roles. And perhaps small business owners have taken the place of Jefferson's yeoman farmer, that small business owners are the ones with the true knowledge of the country, and their wisdom should be taken into account. So Republicanism isn't dead, but it might not be as dominant as liberalism. It would be remiss if we didn't add in some other voices, especially as we talk about how institutions develop and are challenged. The Civil Rights Movement and now the Black Lives Matter movement have tended to use notes of republicanism and liberalism in order to justify their movements. Feminism has done the same thing. There's liberal feminism, and then there's more radical feminism that tends to go outside of that. And the LGBT movement has often established itself as part of these traditions as well. And you can think about that with same-sex marriage or marriage equality, that the right to marriage is seen as a fundamental right in society, and that the exclusion from a fundamental right is a violation of our principles as a nation. Well, what principles would those be if not the principles of liberalism and individual rights, but also republicanism and the idea that we give up certain freedoms to get certain things back? So that brings us to our Federalist Papers. There are three that I assigned, one of which I'm going to touch on and then we'll come back to when we talk about the judiciary, which is Federalist 78. Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 are extremely important to understanding our governmental structure. In Federalist 10, Madison wrote about the idea of factions and how our Constitution can only be is the only thing that can guard against factions. Now remember what the Federalist Papers were. They were op-eds placed in papers, newspapers rather, to encourage people to ratify the new Constitution. So each Federalist paper was aimed at a specific topic in order to convince people that the Constitution was a worthwhile enterprise. And while this was being done, the language used by the Federalists was very much one that insisted upon the adoption of the Constitution in order to guard against being taken over by a foreign country. There was a real concern that what would happen was that the country would fall apart and the Articles of Confederation were already showing some wear, and they weren't that old. We had rebellions popping up, and that these rebellions would lead to an unstable government, which would eventually be taken over by likely Britain again, but possibly France, and that we needed to have something to guard against that as a nation. So Federalist 10 is specifically talking about this idea of factions. Factions being a group of people united by common impulse. And Madison is very careful to use these words, saying that factions are not a group of people who get together to consciously think through governmental change, but rather people who are united by impulse and not necessarily a thoughtful process. Now, he says that in a democracy, in a pure democracy, the will of the majority overtakes any minority rights. And that's not to say racial majority or minority, but that could be political majority or minority. And in fact, that's what Madison meant. So why is that a problem? Well, if you have the constant erosion of rights of the minority based on the whims of the majority, you're going to have an unstable government and a sort of repeating pattern of this over and over. So he says the Constitution can guard against factions better than anything else. So he says first that you cannot get rid of factions because of the nature of man, they will exist, and because of the nature of liberty. And so Madison says that air is to fire what liberty is to factions, that you can get rid of air to get rid of a fire, but then you can't breathe. Or you could get rid of liberty to get rid of factions, but then what's the point? So we have to control factions. We can't get rid of them. And he offers two ways in which the Constitution and our structures get rid of or control for factions. One is by spreading people out geographically, and that assuring that people cannot get together on a whim and try and overtake the government. The second is to have a diverse population that has different views and different goals so that we will never have a situation where enough people have the same impulse and can act recklessly. Instead, our legislative processes can take care of these things and refine these values as they go up the chain and eventually make their way into law. Federalist 1 echoes this, and this is again a Madison written Federalist paper, saying that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So this sort of echoes Locke in a way by saying that government is a necessary evil, but then also says why more layers of government, which is not something Locke would advocate for, are important. And so Federalist 51 talks about checks and balances, that each branch of government is given a defense against the other branches. And so for the president, for example, you have the veto to check against the Congress's power. Now, Congress can override that veto, but it would take an extreme situation for that to happen. And in fact, that only happened one time for President Obama. And it's not necessarily that he vetoed far less than everybody else, and so there weren't those opportunities. It's simply that the ability to get an override on a veto is pretty difficult. So Federalist 51 says the Constitution is great because it sets up these checks and balances in our institutions. So this is our fundamental institutions Federalist paper because it talks about these checks and balances and says this is what will guard us from problems down the road. And part of our question, our overarching question of whether our government works is going to be whether these checks and balances really do work themselves. Federalist 78, briefly, is about the power of the judiciary to check the other two branches of government. And this was a Federalist paper written by Hamilton. We'll talk about it more when we talk about the judiciary and judicial review, but the concept of judicial review was very much something that people that didn't like the proposed Constitution, they feared. The idea of an appointed branch deciding that the actions of elected branches were incorrect was something quite fearful and something that many people disagree with today. But Hamilton outlined the fact that this was an important check on our government and on popular will, because popular will isn't always right. Millions of people can do the wrong thing. And that's not just to say politics, but, millions of people have done the wrong thing a lot of times. Even in the most ridiculous of circumstances, you can argue millions of people have done the wrong things. I mean, we've had winners of American Idol who surely did not deserve that honor, limited as it may be. So Hamilton argues that these people will kind of be these enlightened statesmen, or maybe what Plato referred to as philosopher kings, and acting as a check on these more popular impulses. So that brings us to our counter-argument, AntiFederalist 17 and Brutus 1, and I'm actually going to go in reverse order of that. Brutus 1 is a good overview of anti-federalist rhetoric. So Brutus outlines the problems of the Constitution as he sees them. One is that the Constitution is going to govern an area that is far too big to ever be a successful country. It's so big that Brutus says that no one government can unite all of it, and no one government can address the problems that are common to it, because they just either will be ineffectual or it won't happen. So size is a problem. The scope of the government and what it does is far too large. There's too much given up to the federal government as opposed to left to the states. Diversity of citizenship is a problem. And Brutus was fairly honest and somewhat has a point by saying that when people are so diverse that they have different values, and then he points out different religions in particular, that you cannot find one governmental form that suits them all. So that a government this big, over this many diverse people, over this scope of land, is necessarily going to fail. And to do this, he uses historical precedent. He says anytime this type of thing has been done, there have been failures. Left and right, there have been failures. Rome descended into an empire with an emperor, as opposed to remaining a republic for a reason. And so Brutus points out that what we're trying here has been tried, and it has failed. And therefore, we would be foolish to try it again. AntiFederalist 17 also adds on to these by saying that the Constitution represents a subversion of state authority. And states were important to people at this time because the colonies joined together to fight off the war, but they didn't necessarily believe wholesale that they should be one united government. Now, for some purposes, like national defense, they felt like maybe there was a point there. But for other purposes, like infrastructure, states were believed to be better entities to do things like this. So the problem for this Anti-Federalist 17 was that the Constitution, and this is in the preamble, starts off by saying that the power is given to the federal government by the people. And that leaves out the states entirely. So the people empower the federal government and the people empower the states, but that the two are going to be at odds. And the Constitution, this paper argues, really gives all of the good stuff, for lack of a better term, things like coining money, being able to have a debt, and those types of things. Those are all things that states need to and want to do to make their states better. But those powers are now being given up to the federal government. And Anti-Federalist 17 also points out the problem with federal courts, that these are people who will be in an unelected branch, and that even if Congress wants to change what they can hear, and Congress can, they will be looked to as the ultimate authority, and that state courts will ultimately be looked at as less authoritative than federal courts. And there's a point there, because in the legal profession, quite honestly, state courts are not always looked to with the same reverence that federal courts are. Now, the debate was settled, right? The Constitution was ratified and went into effect. But we still have these arguments all the time. These are perpetually the arguments that we face when we talk about politics and policy. And the role of government and how economics plays into that, whether you're talking about taxes, whether you're talking about job creation, is that something government should be involved in? The problems that society has outside of government, should they be something that government tries to solve? Should racism be something the government tries to solve? And should it have its hand in that? That's a role of government question. Now, that isn't to say that when someone raises that question, they're ultimately being very philosophical all the time. Some people will say, well, no, government shouldn't interfere with that because they don't want anything to change. But on the other hand, there are people who have legitimate concerns about the way things happen. So there are many people who feel that same-sex marriage would be much more secure of a right if it were done through legislatures rather than federal courts. That the role of government should not necessarily be vested in a court decision or be kind of talked about that way in a court decision, but should be something that goes from the bottom up, from the people up. So the role of courts in particular has become this idea, or rather this kind of lightning rod for the role of government and the role of judges. Different state policies reflect different ideas about the role of government. So states like Mississippi or Kansas believe in a much more limited government than states like New York or California. And you could argue, well, that's all about demographics, it's all about pure population differences or size differences, but it's also differences in what you believe government should do. There is still a belief that we should protect property, and many of our laws protect property, and in a way that not every other country has. So that goes back to American exceptionalism. So things like we believe people should own a home. That's an American value, is home ownership, and the belief that government should have a role in making the market affordable for people. So federally backed mortgages. That type of ideology is something that stems from a belief that property ownership is important. There are many people for whom renting is a much better economic decision, but government tips the scales in favor of property ownership because you could do things like deduct your mortgage interest. So American exceptionalism is still alive and well, and that can be heard in our political rhetoric. And that, kind of goes back to the Iglesias piece, talking about how American exceptionalism may exist, but that doesn't mean that everybody else believes America is that replicable elsewhere, that other places may think, America's fine, but that isn't what we want to do, nor will it work for us. So this goes back to our question of governmental legitimacy and governmental efficacy and what we can do moving forward.